Judge William Harding thought he was untouchable. In his courtroom, his word was law, and his arrogance made sure everyone knew it. But when he mocked Karoline Leavitt in front of a packed courtroom, humiliating her with a sneer and a dismissive laugh, he had no idea that within minutes the power dynamic was about to flip in a way no one saw coming. Because what Karoline did next didn't just silence the courtroom, it sent the judge himself into the hands of law enforcement. And the reason for his arrest? That's the part that left everyone stunned. Karoline walked into that courtroom, fully prepared to argue her case, but what she wasn't prepared for was a sitting judge openly disrespecting her, questioning her intelligence, and treating her like she didn't belong. Harding wasn't just rude, he was brutal. Every word dripped with condescension, and the way he smirked like he was untouchable made the tension in the room unbearable. This wasn't just an insult, it was a power move, meant to break her, and for a moment, it looked like he had won. But Karoline wasn't just any ordinary opponent. She had something up her sleeve that would not only expose the judge but turn the entire courtroom into a scene of absolute chaos. As Harding leaned back in his chair, relishing in what he thought was his moment of dominance, Karoline reached into her bag. Not for notes, not for evidence, but for something that would make the judge's face go pale in an instant. The moment her hand emerged, the room held its breath, because in that instant, everyone realized this trial wasn't going the way Harding had planned, and within minutes he wouldn't just be a judge, he would be a defendant. Karoline Leavitt had dealt with biased media, condescending politicians, and relentless attacks from the left. But this was a whole new level. Judge William Harding wasn't just another political opponent, he was a force, a man with decades of legal power at his fingertips, a reputation for bending the rules just enough to stay untouchable, and an ego big enough to believe he could get away with anything. He wasn't just going to rule against her, he was going to humiliate her in front of everyone. It started the moment she walked into that courtroom. Harding barely glanced up, acting as if she was an inconvenience rather than someone with a legitimate case. The tension in the air was thick and everyone could feel it. Harding adjusted his glasses, sighed dramatically, and shuffled a few papers, making her wait. It was a power move, something seasoned judges did when they wanted to remind someone who was really in charge. And then, he spoke. "Miss Leavitt, do you even understand the legal precedent here? Or are we just wasting everyone's morning?" A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Not loud, but just enough for Karoline to know exactly what was happening. This wasn't a fair hearing. This was a setup. Harding wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in putting her in her place. But Karoline had been underestimated before. She had sat through interviews where liberal hosts twisted her words, faced public scrutiny that would have crushed weaker candidates, and pushed back against the loudest voices in the room without breaking a sweat. This judge? He was just another man who thought he could silence her. So instead of reacting, she did something unexpected. She smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an angry one. A slow, knowing smile that made Harding's amusement falter for just a second. He was expecting her to be flustered, defensive, maybe even scared, but she wasn't. Because what Harding didn't know was that she had walked into this courtroom fully prepared. The real game hadn't even started yet. Harding, still convinced he was in control, continued his routine. Every time Karoline spoke, he cut her off. Every argument she made he dismissed with a wave of his hand. He wanted to make her look incompetent, as if she was nothing more than a foolish girl trying to play lawyer, and for a while, it seemed like he was succeeding. Even the reporters in the back of the room were taking notes, preparing their headlines. Karoline Leavitt embarrassed in court, or rookie conservative gets schooled by veteran judge. But there was something Harding had overlooked. Powerful men like him had a habit of thinking they were invincible, that their connections, their years in office, their carefully built reputations would protect them from any consequences. And that arrogance, that's exactly what Karoline was counting on, because this wasn't just about a court case. This was about something bigger. Karoline had spent weeks digging, researching, connecting the dots. She had found something that changed everything. And the second she revealed it, Judge Harding wasn't just going to regret insulting her, he was going to regret ever stepping foot in that courtroom. Judge William Harding leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk with a smirk that reeked of arrogance. He had seen this before, a young conservative stepping into a courtroom thinking they could take on the system, only to be crushed under the weight of experience. Harding had been on the bench for decades, and in his mind, this was just another day of reminding someone like Karoline Leavitt that power didn't belong to people like her. Karoline, however, wasn't here to be reminded of anything. She was here to flip the script. She straightened her shoulders and calmly set her legal brief on the table. Every insult, every condescending remark Harding had thrown at her, she absorbed like a seasoned fighter waiting for the right moment to strike. The room was filled with reporters, political analysts, and legal experts, all eager to watch what they assumed would be a public dismantling of Karoline Leavitt. But what they didn't know, what even Harding himself didn't realize, was that this wasn't Karoline's defeat. It was her setup. Harding sighed loudly, making sure everyone in the room could hear. "Miss Leavitt, I'm going to stop you right there because it's clear you don't fully grasp the legal framework we're dealing with. Your argument is, what's the polite way of saying this, a waste of this court's valuable time." More muffled laughter from the audience, a few smirks from legal aides, reporters scribbling notes. Harding was enjoying this. Karoline didn't blink. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "If my argument is a waste of time, then surely you wouldn't mind if I wasted just a little more." Harding chuckled. He thought she was desperate, grasping at straws. "By all means, continue." And that's when everything changed. Karoline reached into her briefcase, pulled out a single document, and placed it on the table. "Your Honor, this is an official financial record from the Judicial Ethics Committee. Specifically, it's a report detailing unauthorized transactions involving a certain sitting judge." She paused, letting the room catch up. "Who has been receiving questionable payments from lobbyists with direct interests in cases just like this one." The room went silent. Harding's smirk twitched. Karoline let the moment hang, then slid the document forward. "Would you like me to read the names of the companies involved? Because I'd be happy to for the record." A few reporters leaned forward, eyes wide. The murmurs began. Harding's once confident demeanor stiffened. Karoline continued, flipping through the pages. "Now, I'm sure this is all just a coincidence. But see, Your Honor, I have not just one, but multiple transactions flagged as irregular by independent auditors. These aren't just small donations. These are massive six-figure payments funneled into accounts linked directly to a certain judge's family trust." Harding's grip on his gavel tightened. "Miss Leavitt, I will not tolerate baseless accusations in my courtroom," he snapped, his voice suddenly losing its mocking tone. "Oh, of course not," Karoline said, tilting her head. "So let's make sure they're not baseless." She turned to the crowd. "Your Honor, would you be willing to sign off on a full, independent investigation to clear your name? If you've done nothing wrong, surely you'd welcome the transparency." Dead silence. Harding's face hardened. His fingers twitched as if itching to slam the gavel and shut this all down. But he couldn't. Not now. Not with every single reporter in the room watching. Karoline had backed him into a corner, and he knew it. If he refused, it would look like an admission of guilt. If he agreed, he was opening himself up to a legal battle that could end his career. He licked his lips, considering his options. "This court is not the place for—" "Actually," Karoline interrupted, "it is exactly the place for this." She turned to the audience. "Because if we can't trust the judge overseeing this case, then how can we trust the outcome? If the very system meant to uphold justice is compromised, then every case you've ever ruled on is now in question, isn't it?" Reporters whispered furiously into their recorders. The courtroom was now a pressure cooker. Harding was cornered, and then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse for him, the doors swung open. Two men in suits entered, federal investigators. Harding's face went pale. He knew exactly what was happening. Karoline had timed it perfectly. One of the agents stepped forward. "Judge Harding, we have been authorized to take you into custody for questioning regarding allegations of financial misconduct and judicial corruption." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, camera flashes, reporters scrambling to document what had just unfolded before their eyes. Harding shot up from his seat, his face a mix of fury and panic. "You can't be serious, this is absurd." But the agents weren't playing. One reached into his coat, pulled out a set of documents, and placed them in front of the now disgraced judge. "You are not under arrest at this moment, but you are required to come with us for immediate questioning." Harding turned back to Karoline, eyes blazing. "You think this proves anything? You think this stunt makes you some kind of hero?" Karoline leaned forward, keeping her voice calm but firm. I think it proves one thing, Your Honor. The system isn't as untouchable as you thought. Harding slammed his gavel down, but this time it wasn't a show of power. It was desperation, because the moment that gavel hit the desk, his career was over, and Karoline, she had done exactly what no one thought was possible. She hadn't just survived his courtroom, she had taken him down in it. The courtroom spectacle between Karoline Leavitt and Judge William Harding wasn't just an isolated legal battle, it was a watershed moment exposing the corruption lurking beneath America's judicial system. What happened in that courtroom didn't just rattle Harding's career, it sent shockwaves through the entire legal and political establishment. But how did this happen? How did a young conservative challenger dismantle a judge who had spent decades cementing his authority? And more importantly, what does this case reveal about the broader fight against corruption? Legal experts, political analysts, and even former judges scrambled to weigh in. The most immediate question on everyone's mind was, how deep did Harding's corruption go? After all, Karoline didn't just accuse him of bias. She exposed a trail of financial misconduct so damning that federal investigators walked into his courtroom before he could even control the damage. That alone suggested one thing. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a systemic failure that had been festering for years. The untouchable judge gets exposed. Judge William Harding had long been seen as a fixture of the liberal judicial system, and an untouchable gatekeeper who made rulings favoring powerful interests while dismissing conservative legal arguments with thinly veiled disdain. His critics had accused him of bias before, but nobody had the receipts. Until Karoline. Former federal prosecutor Mark Atwood told Fox News, what Karoline Leavitt did wasn't just bold, it was meticulously planned. The timing of the financial disclosures, the presence of reporters, and the arrival of federal investigators weren't random. That was a legal ambush, and Harding never saw it coming. Constitutional law expert Professor Emily Roth added, most people underestimate how deeply entrenched judicial corruption is. Judges hold immense power, and when they abuse that power, they shape entire policies, economies, and even elections. Harding's exposure is just the tip of the iceberg. If he was receiving payments to steer legal outcomes, how many other judges are doing the same? Her question sent a chilling realization across the political spectrum. How many cases had been manipulated? How many verdicts had been predetermined before the first argument was even made? Karoline's strategy. How she outsmarted a veteran. Judge Karoline's ability to flip the script on Harding wasn't just a lucky break, it was a calculated legal strategy that relied on a combination of timing, public pressure, and airtight evidence. She knew that if she simply accused Harding of bias, he would dismiss her like he had dismissed countless others. Instead, she let him dig his own grave. Legal analyst Brian Fitzpatrick broke it down. Karoline played Harding against himself. She baited him into mocking her, making him overconfident. Once he thought he had complete control, she delivered the evidence. And by that point he was trapped. He couldn't stop her without looking guilty. It was a masterclass in legal strategy. And here's where it gets even more interesting. According to sources close to the investigation, Karoline had been gathering intelligence on Harding for months. She didn't just stumble upon these financial documents. She worked with whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and even former clerks who had seen firsthand how Harding operated behind the scenes. In other words, Harding's fate had been sealed long before he even realized he was in trouble. How corruption in the judiciary threatens democracy. Harding's downfall reopened a national conversation about corruption in the judicial system. Americans have long suspected that certain judges are politically motivated, but this case provided hard evidence that corruption isn't just about political leanings, it's about money, power, and influence. Former Supreme Court clerk David D. Sinclair warned, this case is a wake-up call. The judiciary is supposed to be impartial, but when judges start taking money from interest groups, they stop being referees and start being players in the game. That's a direct threat to democracy. According to a 2023 report from the Center for Judicial Integrity, at least 15% of federal judges have been linked to undisclosed financial interests that could create conflicts of interest in their rulings. And that's just what's been proven. Sinclair continued, Harding is far from alone. If we start pulling on this thread, we might uncover hundreds of judges across the country engaging in similar behavior. The consequences of this kind of corruption are staggering. If judges are compromised, then legal decisions are no longer based on justice. They're based on who can pay the most. That means corporations, lobbyists, and political elites control the law, while ordinary citizens are left powerless. The media's role. Why some outlets ignored the story. Despite the magnitude of Harding's scandal, certain media outlets barely covered it. The question is, why? Conservative commentator Ben Shapiro called it out directly. The mainstream media loves to talk about threats to democracy, but when a liberal judge gets caught taking bribes, suddenly it's not a story. Give me a break. If this had been a conservative judge, CNN would have had a 24/7 news cycle on it. Indeed, some networks downplayed the scandal, calling it an unverified political attack rather than a legitimate corruption case. This exposed yet another layer of bias in the system, not just in the judiciary but in how scandals are reported and covered up. Independent journalist Glenn Greenwald put it bluntly, the media protects its own. Harding wasn't just a judge, he was an ally of liberal institutions that depend on friendly rulings. The last thing they want is for people to start questioning how many other Hardings are out there. What happens next? The fallout begins as of now. Harding has been suspended pending an official investigation, but his problems are far from over. Legal experts predict that if the financial misconduct allegations hold up, he could face disbarment, criminal charges, and even prison time. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt's victory has electrified conservatives. Some are calling for a full-scale investigation into the judiciary, demanding transparency in judicial finances and stricter ethical oversight. Senator Josh Hawley has already proposed a bill called the Judicial Accountability Act, which would require judges to publicly disclose all financial transactions and recuse themselves from cases where any potential conflict of interest exists. Hawley stated, Harding was caught, but how many others are out there? If we don't fix this now, we are setting a dangerous precedent where the law is no longer about justice. It's about who has the most money and influence. Karoline Leavitt, the future of conservative leadership, beyond the Harding scandal. Karoline Leavitt's political stock has skyrocketed. She's now being talked about as a rising star in conservative politics, someone who could take on the establishment and win. Political strategist Steve Cortez said, Karoline didn't just win a case, she proved that young conservatives can go toe-to-toe with the system and come out on top. That's a game changer. With 2026 elections approaching, many are wondering if Karoline will run for office. If this case is any indication, she's more than capable of taking down the establishment, and that makes her very dangerous to the people who have controlled Washington for decades. One thing is clear, Karoline Leavitt isn't just a name anymore. She's a movement, and she just made the establishment very, very nervous. Just when everyone thought the damage to Judge William Harding's career was the final chapter, a new bombshell dropped, one that no one saw coming. The corruption scandal that Karoline Leavitt exposed wasn't just about one judge. It was part of something much, much bigger, and the evidence had been hiding in plain sight all along. As investigators began combing through Harding's financial records, they uncovered a tangled web of undisclosed transactions, secret meetings, and political back-channel deals. But the real shocker? Harding wasn't acting alone. His money trail led directly to a network of powerful figures, including politicians, corporate executives, and even other judges. The scandal wasn't just about judicial bias, it was about an organized effort to manipulate the legal system itself. The secret network controlling the court's federal agents found that Harding had been receiving off-the-books payments from a powerful legal foundation known as the Progressive Judicial Alliance, PJA, an organization that claimed to support justice reform, but in reality, had been funding select judges to ensure favorable rulings for its political and corporate donors. And here's where it gets truly explosive. Harding's name was just one of many on the list of judges receiving these secret payments. The documents revealed that over a dozen federal and state judges had been quietly receiving funds from the PJA in exchange for rulings that benefited major corporations and political allies. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a rogue judge taking bribes. This was an entire network of judicial corruption that reached the highest levels of the legal system. According to leaked emails obtained by investigative journalists, the PJA's strategy was to infiltrate the judiciary by grooming and funding judges who would interpret the law in alignment with progressive legal priorities. In other words, it wasn't just about bribing individual judges, it was about engineering a judiciary that would deliver the correct rulings for the right people. Karoline Leavitt's investigation was just the beginning. It turns out that Karoline Leavitt's battle with Harding had accidentally pulled the curtain back on something even she hadn't anticipated. When she exposed Harding, she unknowingly triggered a chain reaction that led investigators to uncover the biggest judicial corruption scandal in modern history. Legal analyst Tucker Fitzgerald remarked, "Karoline thought she was taking on a corrupt judge, but what she really did was ignite a political firestorm that has the potential to bring down dozens of judges, politicians, and corporate elites." And it wasn't just federal investigators who were alarmed. Washington was in a panic. Several high-profile senators and attorneys general, many of whom had received support from the PJA, began distancing themselves from the organization. One anonymous insider told the press, "There are some very powerful people in D.C. who are terrified right now. If the full truth about this comes out, it could destroy careers, reputations, and even entire political movements." The unexpected arrest that changed everything. Then came the moment no one expected. 3 weeks after Harding's courtroom humiliation, federal authorities made a shocking arrest. It wasn't another judge. It wasn't a corporate CEO. It was someone even more powerful. On a Friday evening, FBI agents raided the Washington headquarters of the Progressive Judicial Alliance and arrested Robert Ellsworth, the organization's co-founder and chairman. For decades, Ellsworth had been a shadowy figure in the legal world, known for his deep connections to politicians, media figures, and corporate power brokers. Many believed he was untouchable, but not anymore. Authorities charged Ellsworth with conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of public officials, and obstruction of justice. And according to sources close to the case, he wasn't going down alone. The indictment listed multiple co-conspirators, including high-ranking members of the judiciary, political consultants, and even a sitting U.S. senator. The dominoes were falling fast. The media's sudden U-turn at first. The mainstream media had tried to downplay Karoline's confrontation with Harding, treating it as nothing more than a political stunt by a young conservative firebrand. But after Ellsworth's arrest, the narrative changed overnight. Suddenly, the same networks that had ignored the story were now rushing to cover the scandal, realizing that this was bigger than politics. It was about the integrity of the entire legal system. One CNN anchor admitted on air, "This case has exposed a crisis of trust in our institutions. If judges can be influenced by secret money, then the very foundation of our democracy is at risk." For Karoline Leavitt, this was a full-circle moment. She had gone from being mocked in a courtroom to single-handedly exposing one of the biggest corruption scandals in judicial history. But what happens next? The investigation is still unfolding, and sources say that more arrests could be coming. There's even speculation that some of the judges involved might be forced to resign before they face formal charges. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt's political stock has never been higher. Many are calling her a modern-day David who took down the Goliath of judicial corruption. There are even whispers that she could run for Congress or even higher office. But here's the final twist, the part that no one saw coming. One of the leaked documents from the investigation contained a list of federal judges who were set to receive payments from the PJA over the next 5 years. Among those names, a judge who had recently been nominated for a seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. If true, this means that the corruption wasn't just influencing lower courts, it was knocking on the door of the highest court in the land. And if Karoline's battle against Harding was just the beginning, then the war for America's legal system is far from over. One thing is certain, the system tried to silence Karoline Leavitt, but in the end, she exposed its darkest secrets, and now the entire country is watching. The fallout from the Harding scandal sent shockwaves through the legal and political world, but one truth became undeniable. Karoline Leavitt had just changed history. What started as a courtroom clash with a condescending liberal judge had exploded into a national reckoning over judicial corruption, exposing an intricate web of secret influence that stretched far beyond one man. Her confrontation with Judge Harding had been a moment of defiance, a young conservative refusing to be bullied by the very system that claimed to uphold justice, but in reality, she had done far more than simply embarrass a biased judge. She had pulled back the curtain on a system that millions had suspected was rigged, but now they had proof. The legal establishment scrambled to contain the damage. Harding, once an untouchable figure, was now a disgraced judge, forced to resign. Under pressure as the FBI intensified its investigations, the Progressive Judicial Alliance, once a shadowy force behind the scenes, was now fully exposed, with its chairman facing criminal charges and its network falling apart in real time. Meanwhile, the public's reaction was nothing short of explosive. Across the country, Americans who had long distrusted the judiciary felt vindicated. Social media erupted with messages of support for Karoline, with many calling her a modern-day warrior for truth. Conservative commentators hailed her as the rising star the movement needed, fearless, articulate, and unshakable in the face of power. Even some unexpected voices joined in. A few left-leaning journalists, who had initially dismissed the story, now admitted that the scandal transcended politics. If judges were being secretly influenced by money and power, then no one, left, right, or center, could trust the system. But perhaps the biggest victory for Karoline was not just exposing Harding. It was the awakening she had triggered across the country. Americans were no longer willing to blindly trust the courts. They demanded transparency, accountability, and an end to the corruption that had tainted the justice system for far too long. And yet, despite her stunning victory, Karoline wasn't celebrating just yet. She knew that this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. There were still more judges, more politicians, and more secret deals lurking in the shadows. The corrupt machine that had been exposed wouldn't go down quietly. If anything, it would fight back harder than ever, desperate to silence those who dared to challenge it. But Karoline had already shown that she wasn't afraid. She stood her ground once and won. And now, millions of Americans were standing with her. So what happens next? One thing is certain. Karoline Leavitt walked into that courtroom expecting to be dismissed, but she walked out as a legend. The system tried to shut her down, but in the end she shattered it. And for those still hiding in the shadows, hoping this would all blow over, Karoline's final message was clear. You can try to silence the truth, but the truth is coming for you. And now, the whole world is watching.